I am forever saying to Josh, preach more grace, teach more grace. Because even selfishly for me, I always want and need more grace. And I know that the world needs it too. And so I'm always saying, Josh, teach grace. Grace, I just know, I was saved when I was an adult, and I just know what grace did for me and how it transformed my life. And it's something that I always want a greater understanding and a greater expectancy for, is God's grace. And because his word says that he gives it freely, and I need it freely, right? Whatever I step into each day and each year, I need more of his grace, more and more. No matter what the season is, I need a different type of grace than I did yesterday. I need more of it. And like you step into marriage and you need grace. Even when you marry the best one, you need grace. And then and then we have kids. And then we need more grace. And that's just one child. We have 4 children. I need a lot of grace. So I'm constantly trying to learn it. You know, even on the good days as a parent, we need grace. Yesterday was a great day. We had a great day with the kids. And then last night, Josh and I are in the lounge room, and Luelle was talking about ballerinas and looking at a book. And I said to her, what do you want to be when you grow up, darling? And Jack, he's 6, he pipes up, I want to be a nothing. But he said it with like a confidence, like, I said, I beg your pardon. He goes, what do you mean you want to be a nothing? He goes, I want to be a nothing. I said, no, you don't. He goes, yes, I do. I said, what's a nothing? He goes, I want to stay and look after the kids. Lord, give me your grace. And this is a good day. We need his grace on the good days. This is a compliment in the world of parenting. I think what you're trying to say is I'm doing a good job. But he gives us grace on the good days and the bad days, and we can expect it. We have to increase our expectancy, and he is so gracious to give it to us. Some of us are good at expecting grace in the little things, but not in the big things. And some of us are actually good at expecting his grace in the big things, but not the little things. Right? And I think the little things get left behind, and we just get on with the job. And he doesn't want us worrying about the little daily lacks of grace. He's filled them for us. And even in the seemingly trivial things. I married a man that didn't cook. But by the grace of God, I have a man that can cook. No. That deserves a big clap, ladies, right? I spent years, and I loved to cook. When we got married and there was no kids, I would cook his dinner, pack his lunch. I loved it. You know, it was like a hobby. I loved cooking for him. And I wasn't at all upset that he didn't cook because I loved doing it. But then we had a bunch of kids, and it turns out I don't love to cook. I love to sleep. And so Josh had to learn how to cook. But every time this man cooks, and he cooks all the time, every time this man cooks, I'm reminded that God fills his grace in the seemingly small places of our life, if we're expecting it. Thank you, Josh, for cooking for me. But what is grace? We need to understand it, because if we don't accept it, we can't give it. And I think grace is commonly, as it should be, understood as God's unmerited favour. Unmerited favour. Yes, unmerited. We do not deserve it. But it was one paid for with a very hefty price. And so we have to wrap our head around that we are undeserving of God's grace, yet entitled to it. and that it's an authority. Jesus paid the price. And so we have to be thankful yet expecting. And increasingly expecting it. No matter what level we seemingly reach, he's got more. He's got plenty more. But grace isn't just what God gives, right? It's who he is. It's the character of God. It's not something he just dispenses. And when we wrap our hearts around it's who God is, it's the character and nature of God is grace, and that it's not something he gives, that should shift our expectancy. We spend our lives, if we're not careful, with a hand out, God, I need a little bit of grace for my marriage. It's struggling. Or I need a little grace over here. Like, not even two hands out. We got one hand out. I need a little bit of grace. I'm struggling with my parenting. Give me more patience. Give me more peace. Give me more confidence. Or maybe it's a relationship. We need some grace. Or maybe it's our finances. And if we're not careful, we can stand with our little hands out. And God, bless God, he will give us the grace that we're expecting, right? Yeah. He'll fill our hand. If it's a hand that we put out, he'll give it to us. And then we grab it and we're thankful for it, so we should be. And then our flesh says, okay, you've probably used enough grace. Maybe just keep praying for another 6 months. When in actual fact, God's got enough grace for all these little hands that we put out, because he is grace and he doesn't just give grace. That's how much grace there is. God is grace so that we can give grace, that we can dispense his grace. He is it so we can dispense it. And Ruth tells us, Ruth depicts the church. And if this is God's grace, if we can just picture the church standing alongside this big circle that encompasses our problems, the church is the one that dispenses it. And we can actually block dispensing grace to others if we're not careful. And someone might be blocking the grace that God is dispensing to you. Maybe just out of a lack of understanding, perhaps. But he gives it freely. And so what's our role in that? How do we get better at dispensing it? Well, firstly, we have to be good at receiving it ourselves and having a proper understanding of how much is on offer and why. I think his word says that by grace you are saved through faith. Ephesians 2:8 says, for it is by grace you are saved through faith. And if his grace can bring salvation, what can his grace not do? Meanwhile, we've got a hand out for a bit over here and a bit over here. If his grace can bring salvation, there's nothing his grace can't do. But it says through faith, that we are saved by grace through faith. And so I think the faith clearly unlocks the grace. So if we want more grace, we're going to need more faith. And so how do we get more faith? Well, it also says in his word that we're not to be conformed to this world. And that we're to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. Romans 12:2, I think, says that. Transformed by the renewing of our mind. And that's where faith takes place. So if we want more grace, we're going to need more faith, and we're going to need more transformation and renewing of our mind. Yeah. And so I think when, you know how we hear those beautiful testimonies of where there was no other choice but to trust God? You'll hear them often like life and death situations, or, extreme situations where they're like, I just called upon God and his grace was upon me and he answered, But every time I hear one of those testimonies, this is what it speaks to me. It wasn't the grace that was missing, it was the faith. When we get desperate enough, we'll lay down our way of thinking. We'll forget it. We've got no choice. And so when we're looking for more grace, it's not the grace that's missing, it's the faith. And we've got plenty of excuses as to why to push that aside. But I guarantee you it is. His grace is freely given, on offer. I'm going to focus on Ruth chapter 1 today. I don't know how you all have been doing more than one chapter at a time. I'm going to focus on one chapter, just one. Ruth chapter 1. It starts, first sentence, last sentence, first verse. It starts with famine. And it ends with a harvest. I could just leave it there. Let's pray. Chapter 1 spells it out to us. It starts with a famine in Bethlehem and in the same place for the same woman. It ends in a harvest. I wanted to read from today verse 8. We'll read from verse 8 to 14. Now, Naomi and her husband and her 2 sons leave Bethlehem. There's a famine, verse 1. And then they go to Moab. Shortly after arriving, her husband dies, right? And I think it says about 10 years later, her 2 sons die. And I can't imagine, right? Who can imagine to lose your husband and your 2 sons? And she's left with her 2 daughter-in-laws. Her sons were married, and she's left with Ruth and Orpah. And so I'll pick up in verse 8, and let's read it together. So Naomi's just decided to leave. There's been complete devastation, and she's decided to go back to Bethlehem. She's heard God is there. And Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." So she kisses them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "Surely we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands?" She's getting sarcastic here. Run. "Turn back, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. For I should say I have hope. If I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So we know that Orpah left. See you, bye. Naomi actually dispensed grace by telling those girls they could go. The custom was that they should stay and look after her, but Naomi said, "No, go." And Orpah left, but Ruth, it says, clung to her. And we know that Ruth goes on to say, "For you go, I will go." She's not leaving Ruth's side. She's not leaving Naomi's side. And obviously Ruth in this represents the church, right? And that we are not to leave the side of those who have lost sight of Jesus or who haven't even found him. But I think when it comes to Orpah leaving, she accepted the grace freely, but couldn't give it. Naomi gave the grace to the girls, and Ruth gave grace by saying and staying. But I think there's a real big difference between the grace that Ruth gave and the grace that Naomi gave. I think Naomi gave her grace and not God's grace. We can do that, right? We dispense grace, but if we're not careful, it's ours and not God's. And so Naomi says go. But, a few verses later, after doing that act, she's empty and she names herself Mara, bitterness. She gives some grace, but I don't think it was God's grace. I think it was all she had. And that's the difference. When we're giving grace to those in our lives and we're feeling empty, it's probably a good sign that it wasn't God's and that it was ours. But Ruth gave God's grace. Ruth stayed, and Ruth walked the journey with her back to Bethlehem, where God could ultimately prove his grace to Naomi. And he does that. He brings us back to show us. And he's a gentleman. He's not going to push us. He'll lead us. Naomi had heard that there was more provision back in Bethlehem. But I often wonder if she could have trusted God in the first place and not left. Would she have been spared the hurt if she'd trusted the inner famine that God can still provide? And we can do the Naomi and step out and go where our eyes might see blessing. But wherever we are, God can bring it to us. And that we've got to shift our thinking, that we don't apply our problems to his grace. And we apply, like his grace, we apply our problems to. But I think there's a shift in the thinking that we apply it to his grace, but that his grace can't apply to our problems in the same way. I think that's, to me, that represents their different way of thinking. Ruth knew that, I think that Naomi lacked some faith, and she had enough faith to bring grace into her life, into Naomi's life, and that's the role that we play as the church. We dispense grace to those around us, so we've got to get good at it. And I guarantee you, the muscle memory of Ruth's grace was already strong for her to do that for Naomi. You can't lead someone who's lost a husband and 2 children without a lot of God's grace. And so what's the muscle memory of our faith? Is it a good one? Is it grace? Or is it our grace? Because he's got so much of it. And it's such a privilege, but it's also such a waste if we don't give it. We can't be the author and just be receiving it and not giving it. And we can't be the Naomi where we just give it and it's ours. We have to be the church. And we have to give the grace that comes freely offered by God. Ruth represents to me the church, that we can do a challenge. I think Naomi was in her comfort of bitterness. She sent the girls on her way. She was happy to stay there. And we can do that and get comfortable in our bitterness or in our lack or in our heartbreak or in our hurt. We can get comfortable. But Ruth represents to me that we can do a challenge, but do it in the real comfort of God, and that his grace allows us to take on the challenges and look after the Naomi's through his grace. And that we can do the hard things by his grace, and that we can expect him to use us in that way. Jonah is sent to Nineveh, right? I mean, if you don't know that story, Jonah and the whale, he's sent to Nineveh. And he doesn't want to go. He literally goes in the exact opposite direction. Now, keeping in mind that Naomi left Bethlehem and also went in a different direction, Jonah doesn't want to go. So he goes in the opposite direction. It says he boarded the next ship and he paid the fare, because that's what we do. We pay the price if we're going to do it our way. But the grace of God, it says, I'll read his word here. It says in Jonah 1:17, now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah. The Lord had prepared. Other translations, it says the Lord had provided, the Lord had sent or the Lord had arranged. And what if we're looking at the problems in our life as problems and not his provision? I think Naomi and Jonah highlight to me that our problems are sometimes the grace of God. And we don't need to understand it. There's this struggle in our faith journey where we're trying to understand it and wrap our heads around it, but that's not faith. You're not supposed to understand it fully. Gosh, not this side of heaven. We're not supposed to understand it fully. And so what if our problems, and this is where we can get hurt when we don't see God move, but what if our problems are actually the grace of God in our lives? He's protecting us from something. He's keeping us from something. I'm sure Naomi looked at her famine and saw it as a problem. But what if God was trying to keep her from the hurt of Moab, of her own decisions, or of Jonah's own decisions? That's God's grace. He's keeping us from the hurt and from the heartaches that we, if we're not careful, can place ourselves in. I want to be the Ruth, and I know you do too, because that's what we're called to be. We've got to be the Ruth who can dispense the grace. We've got to be the Christian in any space, not the grumpy one, but the one full of his grace. We've all met a grumpy Christian. And it should highlight to us that they need more grace and that we can help them with that. We've all met unsaved souls, and it should highlight to us that they need more of God's grace and that we're positioned to dispense it. We can dispense it. What happens if we don't dispense it, though? What happens when we stop dispensing grace, or we're not bold enough to? If we're authors and we just take the grace but don't dispense it, what happens? I think it'll sound harsh, but we can legitimately just block God's grace. That's terrible, right? That we could stand in the way. It's a privilege to be used by God to dispense grace, but we can also block it. And our prayers need to be, let me understand this whole grace thing better than anyone else in the room, so that I can help everyone else in the room. Everyone else is hoping someone else is doing it better than they are. I guarantee you. So our responsibility is to understand it better than anyone. Let me play a part. Let me be the answer. Let me dispense the grace that you give freely. It says in his word that he gives his grace freely. To who? To the humble. It says he opposes the proud and gives it freely to the humble. So teach me to be humble. Teach me to lay down my pride and do something that's not for me. Teach me to do it for someone else. Forget me, and you watch God bless you anyway. But forget me. Let me teach someone else. Let me show someone else. When the church doesn't dispense grace, God is silenced. And no matter what area you apply it to in your lives, if we're not doing it, God is being silenced. We're hoping someone else is doing it, and they're hoping someone else is doing it. You're not forgiving your husband. You're not forgiving your friend. And then it comes back to that whole Naomi thing. If it's God's grace and he gives it freely, what did it cost you? Nothing. Yet we give grace. We muster up enough courage to forgive someone or to apologise or to forget the apology they didn't give that you were owed. But we give it, and then once it's given, it's not your responsibility. So don't go getting upset if someone didn't apologise back, or if someone didn't receive it the way you wanted, or if they ignored it and they continued to hurt you. It wasn't your grace to give. Let's be the Ruth. Let's give God's grace. And so then we can give it again. And if, like it's that often that hurt when we give it and it's not reciprocated, that it actually can hurt us if we're not careful. And it can actually stop us from dispensing it again. And we'll be calling ourselves bitterness because we've got nothing left because we've been giving ours, not God's.
So true.
At work, this is many years ago at work, to be clear, this isn't pastoring, this is policing. Is my mic not working? I don't want to turn anyone off pastoring. This was policing. I was working at South Bank and we got a phone call and at the same time it actually came over the radio. There was a man who had jumped off one of the bridges into the Brisbane River. And we arrived and, unfortunately you know what to do with these jobs. And so we arrived, and by the time I've arrived, I've taken off my shoes, I've handed my partner my gun belt, and I've jumped into the Brisbane River to get this man. And when I arrived, there's a lot to focus on clearly, but this was South Bank on a weekday. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was over the bridge, on the banks, there was about 100 people watching. And this man was in the Brisbane River. And so I jump in, of course, and swim out and start dragging him back in. And by this time, another police officer has joined me. And so her and I drag this man in. And we pull him up the banks, and I start performing CPR, and we take turns until the ambulance arrived, which felt like forever, but I'm sure it was only 5 minutes. And so as I'm doing this, I'm surrounded by people. Like there's people everywhere. And I get it, not all of us are able-bodied, or some of us, it's a pure shock. We might not be able to step in and help this man. But as I'm doing CPR, I'm thinking, what were you all doing? And I get it, right? It's my job, and it's a privilege to play a part. But I'd be lying if I was not mad. I was like, what were you doing? And so doing CPR, and it's not looking good. Ambulance come, and, a while later, this man's confirmed that he's dead. And so we take this man to the morgue, obviously. And it was a little while after this man died, a few weeks later, I looked at the coroner's report when it came out. And the cause of his death was not his injuries from the fall, it was drowning. Right. So this made me even madder. And I was reminded by what people didn't do for this man. I was like, but he was surrounded by people. There was surely someone, at least someone that could have helped him. Come on. This man drowned while you all watched. I was quite mad. And I was also hurt for them, because they were all standing and watching, and they saw that this man died. And imagine what they're carrying around. Now, again, I get it. Not everyone is in a position, nor should they be, to jump into the Brisbane River and pull out a grown man and perform CPR. But come on. We've got more than 100 people in this room today. Some of us might not be able to do that, nor want to, but some of us could. So we should. No one on this day was able to display the grace of God to this man. No matter what value he put, or anyone else in the world puts on their life, we are to see the will of God for their lives. No one. And then if the story doesn't get worse, when we were at the morgue, you obviously need to notify the family. And so I spent a long time. This hadn't happened before. We couldn't locate this man's family. No one. Phone calls, searches. Who does this man belong to? No one. You know who we found? The only person I could find. His wife had died, and I found his mother-in-law, who lived overseas. And so when I found her, I called her. And nothing can prepare you for obviously giving this type of news. And to do it over the phone is obviously very terrible. But she was overseas and this is how it was to be done. Nothing could have prepared me for what was to come next, though. This woman was so bitter. I'm calling her to tell her that her son-in-law has died. And she had no grace whatsoever. And that was so upsetting, because in that moment I was just reminded nobody, not even in this man's death, could provide him grace, right? And then it's a humbling thought to think, oof, but where's my grace for these people? I need to give them grace. It's like this forever revolving grace door. We've got to receive it so that we can give it. And not our grace, but give God's grace. And I feel like that might be quite a heavy story. But in Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. It says in his word that he gives grace freely. That's the will of God. Now, let's not muck around. If you've given your heart to the Lord, you are saved. And we enter into an intimate relationship with Jesus. And if we do that, if it's truly an intimate relationship, well, then we should know the will of God. And we should know when to act or when to stand back. That we get to outwork the will of God and that we can dispense it. And as Ruth represents in that book, she's the church. And we have a faith family to encourage us in this. And it's sitting beside you all. Right? And, shock horror, it's not just the four walls of this church. The church. Yes. We've got churches all over this country, all over this region, all over the world that we can draw upon. You know? We've got friends that don't go to this church. We've got loved ones. We've been to different churches. We've got a body of Christ to encourage us in this. And we all need the encouragement if we're going to dispense his grace. Yeah. So I think I just wanted to help depict God's word, that we get to apply God's grace to our problems and not our problems to his grace, because that's how much he gives. And if we understand how much he's going to give to us, if we truly understand how much he's going to give to us, we're going to give it freely. We're going to expect it in the small handfuls, but learn to trust him in the big ones and learn to trust him to cover us all in all of it.